welcome everyone. My name is Ashley Walters. I am an assistant professor of Jewish studies here at the College of Charleston. I'm also director of the Pearlstein-Lipoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture. I'm also in the process of losing my voice, so I apologize and please bear with me tonight. I'm joined by my co-host, Kim Browdy, Associate Director of Community Relations here in the Jewish Studies program at C of C. And I have the distinct pleasure of hosting tonight's event and our special guests who I'll introduce in just a second. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Jewish Studies program. And I'm sad to say that this is the second to last event that we will be hosting this year. Our final event of the semester will take place on Sunday, April 24th at 10 a.m. And we are going to welcome Professor Terrell Dobbs of University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she will share her research on music and the Holocaust. This is a hybrid event. As many of you know, Sunday morning events come with our brunch spread, a pretty impressive brunch spread, and time to meet with attendees as well as guest speakers. The door opens at 9, so if you decide to join us in person, we look forward to having you. So what I'm going to do is explain how tonight's event is going to work. Tonight, I'm going to take the liberty of beginning our conversation by asking Anastasiia and Chad some questions. After that, we'll take questions from the audience. I kindly ask that you type your question in the chat box, which Kim and I will be monitoring throughout the talk. As we work our way through the questions, I will invite you to unmute yourself and ask the question. In the case that you're unable to speak up or you'd prefer simply not to ask a question in person, I'm more than happy to do that for you. So our goal is to try and get through as many questions as we possibly can in an hour. The event will end at 6. And we will be recording tonight's session, which will become available on YouTube in the next couple of days. So to avoid any unintended audio, please double check that your microphone is off at this time. Okay, so now for our guests. Anastasiia Strakhova is a doctoral student or candidate, at Emory University, where she specializes in modern Jewish history, East European history, and migration. I have to say, I had the opportunity to read one of Anastasia's chapters from her dissertation in January, and I was completely blown away by the scope and detail of the material she covers. She offered this fantastic chapter looking at the mechanics of how Jews migrated out of Eastern Europe, which was illegal at the time. And it's really it's going to be such a wonderful intervention in the fields of East European Jewish history and migration studies. Anastasiia is finishing her degree in June and has already accepted a postdoc at Duke University. So we're very excited to keep her in the South with us, but it's all very exciting news. Anastasiia is going to talk about her personal life in a little bit, so I'm going to hold off on introducing kind of the connections she has to what we'll be talking about tonight. But I do want to introduce Professor Chad Gibbs. He is an assistant professor and director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston. He is a historian of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, modern Germany, and the Second World War. His current project focuses on gender, geography, and social networks in Jewish resistance at Treblinka. And Chad has held fellowships from the Claims Conference, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Yale University Fortunoff Video Archive, the George L. Massey Program in History, and the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, where he remains an affiliated researcher. So please join me in welcoming our guests tonight. I think a good place to begin is with Anastasiia, and I would love to have you tell us about your experiences growing up in Kharkiv, and maybe some about your research as a grad student here in the US.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very honored to talk about my personal experience here today because Then the war started. I was just accumulating everything inside myself, and I'm so happy to let it out and share what I'm feeling now, and maybe answer your questions, and maybe just raise awareness of what is going on in Ukraine and how it is important for the entire world, basically. So I must say that there is an opinion that Ukrainian nation was born in 2014, and probably it talks a lot about my experience growing up in post-Soviet Ukraine, and I will explain now that in more detail. So first of all, I need to mention that what I experienced in Kharkiv, which is a city right on the border with Russia, is very different what people experienced in Western Ukraine. So if I was growing up in Western Ukraine, my experiences would be completely different. But since my region is the region that mostly affected by war, I think I will just concentrate on what was going on in post-Soviet Ukraine when I was growing up. And I must say, and it might came as a surprise, that when I was growing up in Kharkiv in 1990s, early 2000, I didn't feel Ukrainian at all. I was born shortly before the Soviet Union collapsed, and my childhood experience was in post-Soviet Ukraine, which was in deep economic crisis, and many people expressed nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And my mother had to work hard, my parents divorced, so inevitably I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. And especially with my grandfather and great-grandfather, and they both were World War II veterans. And they, even though they were ethnic Ukrainians and like they had Soviet passports with the nationality there, that was written that they're Ukrainian, they, like, I never heard them talk in Ukrainian. They were just speaking Russian. And I think their identity was more, not maybe Soviet, but post-Soviet, that's for sure, not Ukrainian, that's for sure, even though they lived all their life in what is now Ukraine. So inevitably, they had impact on my self-identification as well. So I remember growing up and seeing their war medals. They had this very fond memories of the Soviet times and the Soviet victory over Nazis. I think their identity was built a lot on this really gigantic event of Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. And I remember they had like boxes with medals. And when I was growing up, I was just taking those boxes and looking for these medals, trying to imagine what they were all about. And my great-grandfather actually had the Lenin medal. I'm not sure how to translate it properly to English, so I felt very proud of him. So first of all, my experience was with like growing up in a Russian-speaking family with very pronounced post-Soviet identity on the one hand, and then at school I just lacked patriotic education. There was no patriotic education whatsoever at that time. So first of all, a language of education was Russian. All our subjects were taught in Russian. I started learning Ukrainian only in the 5th grade, at the same time when I started learning English. So can you imagine that I started learning language of my own country when I was like 10, at the same time that I started learning foreign languages. And I think I started, my national awareness started rising around 2004, during the time of the Orange Revolution, and we can talk about this more if somebody would be interested. As you may know, this what we call in historiography Orange Revolution. This is the peaceful demonstration of people in Kiev who took to streets after what they believed was unfair calculation of the election results. Before that, I considered myself quite apolitical, and I thought of Ukraine as a very apolitical nation. But this Orange Revolution completely changed my mind. I went to Kiev because I was curious. I was going through the streets of Khreshchatyk. I talked to people who were living there in tents. They presented me an orange flag, and it smelled like barbecue because people were heating those tents. So everything in the street and in those tents, they were permeated with the smell of fire. So I would say this is when I started to be proud of being Ukrainian, and I realized that Ukrainians are a separate nation and not just something like I felt before, that we are just post-Soviets that appeared on different sides of the border then the Soviet Union collapsed. And then, of course, the big boom in the national awakening happened in 2014 during the Euromaidan and the shootings, which also happened in Khreshchatyk, and we also can talk about this more. But what I wanted to stress is that really this self-perception as Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine is rather a new thing, and this is what I experienced growing up. And then I received my MA at Central European University in Budapest, and then I continued studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And I think after the Euromaidan and my maybe like separation from Ukraine, then I moved to the US. I started feeling more connected to my land and really wanted to learn its history. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that really wonderful window into your kind of evolution as you came of age within this kind of increasingly politically contested sphere. I wonder if you could bring us forward to more recent events and what the experience has been. I know you've been in Mainz during this time, but your family hasn't necessarily, and many of your friends were also still in Kharkiv. So could you just talk a bit about what's been going on over the past few months for you, for your friends and family?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, nobody really believed that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, the entire country, even after 2014. People recognized that the Crimea was an autonomous republic, and some people really felt pro-Russian there. The same is in the Donbas area. And many people who were pro-Ukrainian and living in the Donbas area, they actually became refugees in other Ukrainian cities. For example, a lot of people moved from Donbas, from Donetsk and from Lugansk. Many of them moved to Kharkiv and started their new life there. When even then the United States and Joe Biden started talking about the possibilities that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, nobody really believed that they, most of my friends and family, they believed that just some political games to weaken Russia on the in the political arena. Nobody really believed that the invasion would happen, and they actually thought like, oh, is Putin that crazy? Like how it can be possible that he can invade Ukraine? So only one of my friends really believed this warnings coming from the US and moved from Ukraine before the war started. But other people were just living their normal life. Even on November 23rd. And even when the war started, nobody really believed in the scale that this war is going to take. For example, I was in Mainz at that time on the writing fellowship, and then I woke up on February 24th. I called my mother, like I learned the news, and I called my mother and told her, like, you have to leave. And she said, like, no, I won't, because Putin is just going to bomb the military objects. Nothing really is going to happen. So the civilians are safe. But then soon they realized that the houses of ordinary people under shelling. Putin doesn't care whom to bomb. He only uses military objects as an excuse and throwing bombs everywhere. So people just tried to evacuate, but at first evacuation was very difficult because several thousand people wanted to flee the city, and it was just impossible logistically. So as for now, because we already almost, that's already almost 2 months since the war started. So I think all my friends and family who wanted to flee and to escape the war, they did that. But there are some people are still there. And that's their choice. They don't want to leave because they believe that this is their land, this is their country, and Putin troops, Russian troops have to leave, not them, because this is their country, this is their city, and they just need to stay because this is their home.
Yeah. Chad, could you perhaps follow up by talking a bit about the current state of affairs in Ukraine right now? What exactly is going on?
Yeah. First, I want to say thank you to Anastasiia for joining us and sharing her story. Really glad to help in any little way I can here. So as the whole audience will probably know, just as give a little refresher here, this current iteration of Russia's war against Ukraine started 56 days ago on February 24th. But I want to take a cue from one of my colleagues, Amber Nickel at Fort Hays State University, and think of this currently as an escalation instead of something new, because Russia has been at war with Ukraine since 2014, as Anastasiia talked about. But we have been too easygoing on that in the West, and we have thought too much of this as a new thing. But in those last 56 days that really have that continuity from 2014, Russia began by sending troops through its Belarusian ally, or almost one could say puppet, through Lukashenko's regime in Belarus to attack from the north, so that Russia could come from the occupied Crimea in the south, from the Donbass in the east, and from the north, all at the same time. And world opinion or thought was at the time that this might be a very short engagement, that Russia's much greater military power would, some were saying, level Ukraine's ability to defend itself inside of something like 3 days or a week. Obviously, we've seen that that idea completely turned around. And Russia has at this point withdrawn almost entirely from the north, or entirely from the north, and repositioned itself for what is now, sources are saying that it has begun already, the Battle of Donbass, of Russia trying to regroup and come in from the east, with President Zelensky and others saying that this might be Russia's attempt to set up a North versus South Korea sort of situation to try to reevaluate their war goals to reapproach something that would be just separating Ukraine's east from the country and calling that some sort of victory. So that may be in order. At this point, we're also witnessing the absolute massive destruction of the city of Mariupol in the south, where the city has been pretty much effectively leveled, and very few defenders from a pair of units resist still at a place called the Azovstal steel plant on the coast of the Black Sea. We also, before I talk again about this offensive in the east or the Donbass region, we've witnessed the findings of what are obviously massive crimes against humanity in places like Bucha in the suburbs of Kyiv. Their varying reports have told us about military-aged males being shot in front of their homes. Satellite imagery has confirmed that something at least along those lines did take place. Street level reporting has shown large amounts of civilian casualties in that city and others, and mass graves have also been discovered, created by the Russian army, and satellite imagery has also been able to confirm that these things all existed before Ukrainian forces got back into these places. So who did these things is pretty clear for most to see if they want to see it and understand it. And the next phase of this attack seems to be an all-out offensive in the east that will concentrate a great deal of Russian military power in an area that is incredibly flat and open to large-scale maneuver by armored forces and uses of artillery, basically a type of battle that many are feeling Russia is better prepared for than the things that it tried to do in the south and to the north of Kyiv so far. So as we watch that spool up, we could be looking at a new phase of this war that will at least be as terrible as the last, but some are worried could be an even worse escalation of things as they are now.
Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. I want to ask a question of both of you that kind of relates to the current events as they unfold in relation to disinformation campaigns, and ultimately, what are people hearing on the ground? Anastasiia, do you have a sense of the message Russian speakers are receiving on television? Have you been able to really get a sense of what people are being told?
Oh, thank you for this question. And it's an easy question for me because honestly, after 2014, I still had not really positive, but like an okay look, if we can say so, on Russia. I believe that Putin is bad, but we cannot identify Russia just with Putin. Russia is not just Putin. Russia is its culture, its language, its rich history. And then after February 24th, and seeing how many Russians actually do support Putin, and not just in Russia, but also in Russian citizens or Russian immigrants living in Europe and even in the United States, this is really terrifying because, as we know from the statistics, more than 70% of Russians support Putin and his actions in Ukraine. But also something like this happens in Europe, even though now Putin tries to really close all channels that give more or less objective information to the Russian population. Russian speakers and Russian citizens in Europe and in the United States, they have all open sources. They have YouTube, they have internet, they can just go and check more or less reliable information and such channels as BBC, CNN. But for some reason, I see that many Russian immigrants still watch just Russian channels, Russian cable television, wherever they live in Europe. And this is really terrifying because, for example, my mother, she's now in bad relations not only with some of her friends living in Russia, but also in some people who she knew in Europe who immigrated from Russia before, because for some reasons they still trust Russian TV. So I'm really surprised the support that the Putin gets through this massive propaganda, but also it helps me understand how Soviet propaganda worked on Soviet people, because everyone really believed that everything that the Soviet media says is true, and they are the greatest country in the world. So the same seems to apply to Russia today. And there are very few people who actually can think critically of these events and read other media, other sources besides Russian propaganda. And
Go ahead.
I'm sure there is still some of the propaganda going on the Ukrainian side, but of course it's not as massive as from the Russian side. And again, Ukrainians can look for different sources, not just Ukrainian media, but many people speak English and they can check the newspaper reportings in English. But something what Russian propaganda says, that like Bucha is fake, Ukrainians are bombing themselves, Russians do nothing bad in Ukraine. This is terrifying, and even more terrifying that many Russian citizens believe that. So I'm not even sure how to live with that, because it's really scary to think that so many people can be so brainwashed.
Yeah, and I've been hearing accounts of families that are torn apart by this, where one generation believes the propaganda, whereas the younger generation, does not, and just parents and children being torn apart by this as well. That's absolutely heartbreaking. And kind of building off of this, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sorry, I just remembered something else since you asked about propaganda, because since you asked about some methods that Putin's propaganda uses to brainwash soldiers who go to Ukraine, there is some public media that actually identifies Ukrainians with Nazis, which is quite funny, because when we talk about we use the term Nazis only when we're talking about German fascism, and now Russia appropriated this terminology. So not only Russia talks about Ukrainian as Nazis, they instill in their soldiers the feeling that this is a good thing to fight and kill Ukrainians because they are Nazis. So basically they're doing something that their great-grandfathers or grandfathers were doing with Germans during the World War II. And I'm sure Chad can add a lot to that.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and add just a couple of things to that really great explanation. What Russians seem to know about both the alleged justifications of this war and invasion, and, well, we could even begin with what they're allowed to call it. They're allowed to call it a special military operation on Russian media and not use the word war, conflict, invasion, all of those things. We're also getting reports out of the recently liberated cities in northern Ukraine about how Russian soldiers came in kicking in doors and yelling at people, "Where are the Nazis? Show us the Nazis." They're not only talking about this in a larger sense, but they are telling the troops that this is what they're going to Ukraine for, is to denazify, quote unquote, the country. And I'm sure that we will at some point get into the terrifically terrible irony of the justification for invading Ukraine being denazification and of a country that has a Jewish president. So that's just something that has come up kind of again and again in these stories of people who lived under the occupation in the North. Russian state media, and most people getting most of their news inside of Russia through television, is now, just about all media is state media. The last independent newspaper and channel were shut down under heavy uses of what's usually referred to as a foreign agents law in Russia. So by alleging that these independent media sources were in some way supported by foreign governments or foreign funding, they could call them foreign agents and shut them down. So most Russians are now getting their information through organizations that, while they don't necessarily use the word war, are spreading the message about what Putin and the Kremlin want Russians to know about this conflict. And part of that being they're almost certainly not hearing how many Russians have been wounded or killed in this war. That's one of the hopes that we hear in Western media quite a bit, is that something like a resolution might be forced upon the Kremlin by public opinion, seeing as how conservative estimates could be that about as many as 20,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the war so far, which outstrips Russia's entire 9-year invasion of Afghanistan already by quite a bit. And that invasion, people now look back on as part of the process that toppled the Soviet Union. But for this terrible bloodletting to topple the Putin regime would require people know that it even happened. And that is definitely one of the larger problems at this point. These Russian casualties and the debacle that has been the earliest phase of this invasion are not affecting Russian public opinion because Russians simply don't know what's going on right now.
So, in a sense, Chad, you took us in the next direction that I really would like us to go. And I want to, before asking my next question, encourage the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat so that we make sure to prioritize them. I do have a question relating to Jews living in Ukraine. And since we're all Jewish studies scholars here, I thought it would make sense for us to talk a little bit about how Zelensky's Jewish heritage has come up over and again in this conflict. I think, a lot of legwork has been gotten out of his Jewishness, which is ironic given that Zelensky prior to this never really seemed to make claims about his Jewish identity. Chad and I were talking about Zelensky's also has family ties to the Holocaust as well. And so I'm curious to hear Anastasiia, having lived there longer and probably maybe even knew of Zelensky back when he was a movie star or a television star, movie star. Have you watched his Jewishness unfold on a Ukrainian stage or even a world stage? Has this struck you in any way?
So first of all, I don't think that Zelensky ever played his Jewishness, if we can say so. And when he made this speech in Knesset a couple of weeks ago, he was even criticized for not mentioning that he is actually Jewish and his family are Holocaust survivors. What I think is important when we talk about the war in Ukraine and about Russian claims that Ukrainians are Nazis is that if Ukrainians are Nazis, why did they elect a Jewish president, because even though Zelensky never really talks about his Jewishness, everyone knows that he is Jewish. So if Ukrainians are all Nazis, why Zelensky got more than 70% of votes in the presidential elections. So I think this is something that Ukraine can use to prove Russians that they're actually wrong there when they're talking about Ukrainian Nazism. And I'm sorry, just I got a message in the chat. So I just got a message about the person in the audience asked to talk about the Holocaust survivors in Mariupol who died in the same place that she was hiding from Nazis during World War II, and she was 91. Yes, so ironically, people who survived the Holocaust are dying now. And there is also one survivor in Kharkiv, he was 96, I think, that he spent time in many labor camps, Nazi camps. He survived all of them, and then he died. Then the Russian bomb fell on his apartment a couple of weeks ago. So this is just another way to talk about this Russian invasion and how some people in Ukraine believe that it was even worse than the Nazi occupation during World War II, because some cities got more bombed when during the Nazi occupation. And also I had some interviews with elderly people who were evacuated from the occupied cities, and they were given testimonies that Nazis behaved in a better way than Russians now. I am not sure if it's completely true, because of course there were like 80 years between the events, and they were rather small children when during the Nazi occupation, but still a lot of people compare World War II and what is happening now, and the atrocities. They are something that can be comparable, and everyone is quite surprised that something like this can happen in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think the phrase keeps coming up in this, but another terrible irony of this situation has been that I've read about a few Ukrainian Holocaust survivors who are actually currently taking refuge in Germany. And for that whole comeuppance to happen in their lives must be a neck-breaking level of irony to live through.
Jed and Anastasia, we have a question from the audience from Brenda Liederman. She asks, how would denazification appeal to soldiers of a country, Russia, that have seen their own country experience the loss of so much of their own Jewish population?
Who's taking that one? Well, I think the main appeal to it may have nothing to do with a country that has lost so much of its Jewish population, which it has, 1.5 million or so Jewish Russians or Jews of the former Soviet era left for the United States and Israel after the 1970s. We know that story. It's probably much of where this question comes from. But I think that what appeals to Russians is to the Russian soldiers probably has a lot to do with, why the opposite effect of why I would like to wear my 101st pin. In the United States, we have a popular memory in the history of World War II as our triumphal war, and I served in the United States Army and was in this division that made itself famous in World War II. That is a story that we're steeped in, and the Great Patriotic War, the actual name that it goes under in Russia, is a story that everyday Russians are also steeped in. The greatest victories and triumphs of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers being having beaten back Adolf Hitler's Nazi forces and liberated most of Europe. And also, you know, not having gotten enough credit for that is part of the Russian grudge mystique. The West constantly thinking that it was the liberator of Europe and not giving enough credit to Soviet casualties in the war, which were absolutely on a totally other scale than anything that occurred in the West. Part of that, again, would come, I'm saying the word irony too much here, but the unit of that Red Army that liberated so many places and took Berlin itself was actually called the First Ukrainian Front. So these relationships just don't get any less complicated the more you talk about them. I hope that answered the question in the chat. Straight from.
I want to follow up on your point that Russia suffers for their Western world not giving it enough credit for winning World War II. I think that the biggest problem is that it's true that the Soviet Union liberated Europe, but also it kind of occupied those territories, not in military methods, but in ideological methods and in military methods also. Yeah, they were connected. So even in some countries, for example, like in Poland or Lithuania, people tend to forget what the Russian army did to them just because the Russian army came to these lands and tried to impose their rules. So Hungarians are not really happy about that. Poles are not really happy about that. Lithuanians are not really happy about that. So I think this, what happened after the Soviet army liberated those territories, really whitewashed every good effort that they made for these territories. And another point is that I'm actually very, very surprised that the country that has such a cherished memory about victory in World War II is now repeating what the Nazis did at that time. And why I'm surprised, because, for example, I was talking about my childhood, and I was growing up with the slogan, "Never again." And my grandparents told me different stories, and I was growing up with feeling that this is something that cannot happen again. But we also see that the Russian soldiers who now are occupying Ukraine, they're so young, they're like in their early 20s, maybe late teens, that they might not have been growing up with the same stories of their like great grandparents who survived World War II. What surprised me a lot is what happened in the Chernobyl area, where Russian soldiers were digging. Oh my God, I forgot this word in English. Like digging holes. Do you know what I mean?
Foxholes,
yeah.
Fighting positions, yeah.
But yeah, so nobody in their like clear mind wouldn't do that, because they know that this is very dangerous for life. This is life-threatening, but they are doing so. So why they are doing so? They followed the commands, but at the same time, if they knew a little bit of history, they would understand that when you dig ground in Chernobyl, this is a death sentence to you.
Yeah, and you brought up other Eastern European countries and their memories of this as well. We can't stop but we have to carry into Poland. Poland has accepted the largest amount of Ukrainian refugees at this point, and that has everything to do with how Poland remembers World War II and remembers Soviet occupation. Soviet occupation before World War II came to the Eastern Front after, Russia and Germany went to war with each other. The Soviet Union had already taken its slice of Poland. Poland remembers that deeply. Russia does not want to talk about it, and Putin's regime has its own politics of how it will talk about or put up with talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But all of these things, Polish lasting animosities, Hungarian, I meant to say, lasting animosities, these have a lot to do with why the governments of these states have thrown open the doors to Ukrainian refugees. And while that situation may not last, and we shouldn't be too optimistic about how long that welcome will last, that has everything to do with the history of World War II in Eastern Europe, and the history of Hungary remembering its 1956 revolt against communism that was not backed up by the West. A lot of these countries are looking at this situation as a need to support Ukrainian people who could be an avatar for things that would happen to them next. How long that will remain the way they react to things, though, is questionable, worrisome, definitely, but definitely still, again, connected to the World War II history of this area.
Another important point about Polish help that Ukrainian refugees receive is that Poland has also quite problematic history with Ukraine, and the Bandera, like the favorite mystical hero that Putin uses to inspire his soldiers to fight Ukrainians. He was fighting against Poles as well, and there were very many clashes between Poles and Ukrainians in the past, and the flag that Ukrainian nationalists own have, like black and red flag, which is quite often used in Western Ukraine. What I heard about it from one of the Polish volunteers is that it hurts when he sees this flag, but at the same time he understands that Ukrainians are now standing for Poles in this war, because Poland is also afraid that the Putin sick mind might want to continue and invade Poland as well. So I think one of the reasons why Poles help is also they understand that Ukraine is this sort of buffer zone between Russia and Poland itself. And if Ukrainian, God forbid, loses, this is a big problem for Poland too.
Anastasiia, could you kind of continue talking along that theme? I'd love to hear if you could tell us about some of the experiences of Ukrainian refugees, perhaps loved ones that have made their way out of Ukraine, in terms of their experiences as they ultimately begin their lives over again.
I can talk a lot about that, so I will try to limit myself. So, for example, the experience of my mother, who was very lucky to get out of Kharkiv a week after the war started, and there were a massive wave of people who were trying to escape because they didn't know what to expect. Now I think people settled somewhat. And the refugee wave from Ukraine, from Kharkiv, is not that enormous as it was at the beginning of the war, but still people are trying to evacuate. But most of them want to return back to Ukraine when it becomes possible. Very few people actually thinking about staying in the countries where they are now. And one of the obstacles why many Ukrainians don't want to leave Ukraine, even though it can be grave dangerous, is the law according which men from 18 to 60 cannot leave Ukraine. And many of women, even if they have small children, they say like, I'm not going anywhere without my husband, or like, I'm not going anywhere without my dad. So that's why now the Eastern Ukraine have much more internally displaced people than actually Europe, refugees in Europe. We are talking about 2.5 million of Ukrainian refugees in Poland, but I think the number of internally displaced people is somewhere around 6 million, and they all need housing, they all need finances, because most of the people cannot work now, so they need to earn their daily bread somehow. And humanitarian aid that Western countries bring to Ukraine helps a lot, of course, but I think more can be done to this. And also, it would be really great if more countries open their doors to Ukrainian refugees, because Polish economy might collapse quite soon because of so many refugees who are there, and they need financial support, and the government provides that support for them, but also like money will end at some point. So it would be good if more countries open door to Ukrainian refugees. And if we talk about the United States, so just before they went, I heard that those Ukrainian refugees who have families in the United States will be accepted to the US as well. And this would be just very timely, because being in Europe somewhere, like if a refugee comes to Europe, the suffering and the suffering doesn't end when a refugee comes to Europe, because the problem is where to find housing. A lot of people just live in sport halls, like 300 people under one roof. The German government, for example, promises apartments, like some housing for all refugees that it accepted, but it cannot provide apartments for every family. So even though the law says that every refugee will get a place to live, it's not necessarily so. So the more countries will accept refugees, the better, because many Ukrainian refugees in Poland, in Germany, they are living in conditions which are not really humanistic, if we can say so, because they lack funds, they don't speak the languages, the countries cannot accommodate all requests coming from refugees, so this is quite problematic. And it will be good if United States or Israel or Britain accepts refugees, but still like a small number. So the more countries open their doors, even temporarily, that would be good.
Anastasiia, in addition to accepting refugees, is there anything else you could see the US as doing as being really beneficial? Or are there certain moves you'd like to see President Biden take?
So I've been talking to a friend who is in touch with the Ukrainian army and is aware of the army needs. Usually Ukrainian President Zelensky negotiates about weapons, but also the Ukrainian troops need much more stuff, and maybe some initiatives on local level can initiate this. I'm not sure how to be done, but for example, the friend of mine who's in touch with the Ukrainian army told me that the Ukrainian army lacks protective kits such as bulletproof vests level 4, military thermal imagers or thermal monoculars, flak vests, and tactic ballistic goggles. So I know that some initiatives that Americans have to help Ukrainian army in not in weapons, but in like sewing sleeping bags, sending some medical kits. So even something small would be appreciated, because I think now Ukrainian army lacks much more than President Zelensky tries to negotiate with different European and American leaders.
Okay, well, we're basically out of time. I want to thank you, Anastasia. I know it's late there. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your personal experience with all of us, and to Chad for really sharing your insights and knowledge of this vast history with us. It's been really wonderful talking with the both of you. In conclusion, I do want to thank the Jewish Studies Center for kindly sponsoring our event, and thank you to Kim for orchestrating this event and joining me as co-host tonight. Just a friendly reminder that our final event is on Sunday. It's going to be a good one. So join us for Sunday brunch at 10 a.m. as we welcome Professor Terrell Dobbs, and she'll talk about her research on music in the Shoah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.